So here we are with episode 3. Mainly, I think I'm going to cover, this might be a little shorter video, I'm not sure yet, but mainly I'm going to cover here is UV maps for the road and possibly go into the UV maps for the walls and the lines. But the main part here is going to be the road and how I like to do it now. I used to do it a different way, and but the way I do it now seems to save, again, a lot of headache. Mainly, the old way I used to do it when you're first setting up these objects, it was critical that you had to have your objects in quads, mainly because you would use a function what we call follow active quads. So unless the entire object was in full quads, it wouldn't properly follow and propagate down the line as it should. So like down here, like let's say when I made these lines for the pit lane, obviously these are not proper quads. So to UV map this would be basically pretty difficult. I mean, not super difficult, but you would just project from view and then line it up into the UV map. But so, and you can see my road is full of quads, so that's not a big deal. But there may be, where you join other parts of the road together, where you have junctions in, in in certain areas where you have to have triangles and not be perfect quads. So what I came up with is using a perfect quad mesh that is assigned to the curve. It's flat. It doesn't follow the cambers or anything like that. It's not shrink wrapped or anything. All it does is it follows the center line curve that we originally made in the original video. So there's no UV map on this right now, and I don't think I even have a texture. I don't have a texture assigned to it or anything like that. So this is also where things will be different to 2.8. 2.8, you're probably going to want to watch some basic material tutorials on how to assign materials and get your textures to show in the view. In Blender in 2.9, if you're using multi-texture shading, which is all I've ever used, all you have to do is assign a texture to it. You can notice down here, I always like to have the UV map guy window hang out down here. Normally it's the timeline by default, but I always like to have the UV editor, so I just kind of move it up and I have my UV window available. And if I'm doing a lot of stuff, I'll just duplicate this and put it into another on another screen. But for quick edits and stuff, and for this video, I'll be using it down there. So we have all our faces selected, and then we want to choose our object. So we just want to open it up and pick our object. So asphalt clean is my kind of go-to texture. And I said I'll go over texture maps in a later video. These are just ones I've obviously got from my other tracks. And you can see it's kind of a mess. You can see it's actually going the wrong way. The texture map is going horizontal across the surface, and we don't want that. So we're going to bring up our UV map, and you can see what it basically does here is every single one of these uh, faces is this UV map, which covers the entire texture. So initially what we're going to do, being that this texture map goes vertical, we're going to put it on median point so it does it cleanly. We're going to rotate 90 degrees. Oh wait, sorry. I want to make sure I have all my faces selected here. Well, I don't have to, but have, have. And then we select all the faces here. And we get 90. You can see now they're going in the right direction, but they're obviously not good. So now we want to bring this in to be the width of it, and then we can actually want to shrink this down a little bit. Anyway, so you can still see it's not good. It's just doing a repeat because it's only taking up that small section. So now what we want to do, being that this is a perfect quad mesh and all these are perfect squares, we're just going to pick one face. See, this is our active square. Everything's selected. Now we want to do U and follow active quads. And length average is usually fine. It does a pretty good job depending on the size of the faces, but they're all pretty much the same size here. Shouldn't be an issue. And then boom, automatically we got everything laid out into one long line following that quad. So you can see how beneficial that is to have the whole surface in quads. And it's also beneficial to make sure that the face that you're starting from is perfectly square. If it is not, and this guy, say, has a little bit of a skew to it, and that's your active face, and then you follow active quads, you're going to get that, and that's just going to ruin your day. There are ways to fix that, but it's obviously you want to make sure that your face starts off as perfectly square. We'll just undo what we did there. Select again, follow active quads, and there we go. So that's our basics. And you also want to look at your how much your texture is repeating. I like to stretch mine out a little bit uh, to kind of limit how many times the pattern repeats in the diffuse texture. You can kind of see it. This is a piece here, piece here. So as you're driving, you would or look at it like this. You can see all the repeating pattern. So I like to come in here, go to the end. I'll snap to selected. Oh, selected. Cursor to selected. And scale on the. If you scale on the y-axis in the UV map, it's going to stretch things out. You don't want to go too far. I'm just going to go kind of crazy here. But you can see how that made the repeat less uh, overall in how. So if you make it big again, you can see it's just a massive amount of repeat. So it's kind of, you can have it perfectly square, but sometimes I like to stretch it out a little bit because anytime you see a lot of track, um, you want to limit the amount that you see the pattern in diffuse texture repeat itself. So you play with that, see what you like, play with the scale of the UV map. Once you're happy with it, um, you're good to go pretty much. So this is your pattern object that now we're going to send this UV map, this data for this UV map down onto our road surface that we made. Um, so we know that this object is called plane. You can call it whatever you want, but in this particular case, it's just plane because it was the first one I made. And at this point, we don't care about the UV window. So we are going to um, go to our main objects here. And actually, I want to delete all my UV maps that I got here now just to kind of start over. So we got no UV maps assigned to our objects. So actually we want to create new ones that are blank. You have to make sure there's a UV maps and it has to have the same name as your host object. If you come in here and your default name for Blender is UV map, if you're doing a conversion or whatever, and you're coming in here and there's a different name here, you got to make sure they match. You can come in here, you can change a name if you need, but usually by default you can just leave it alone if you're building from scratch. Anyway, so you can see we have our host object. We'll move it up so you can see it a little easier. You will want it to be as close to it as possible, and I'll show you why. But initially, we're going to come in here on the object that you want the data to go to. You add the data transfer modifier. And when you do that, you're going to pick your host object, or you can type in plane if you know the name of it. And we want to do face coordinates here. We'll move this over so you can see. And we want to do nearest face there, and we want to select UVs. And when I click this, it should project UV from the host object down onto the our main road that we have. So now what we want to do is send this same UV map just as a base to all those other objects. So similar to what we did with the multi-user objects, but we're going to link modifiers. So Control L, and we're going to do modifiers, and that's going to send this same modifier over to all the other objects. So now this is the same as this to a degree, but see it's up here elevated. As I move it down, you see it should move the UV a little bit depending on. Yeah, see it's not too bad at this point. Yeah, you can see there, the further it is away, it kind of moves things and distorts things a little bit. So you want it to be as close as possible. I mean, you can hide it so you don't have to have it in view or just turn off the layer that it's in. But that's the basics of getting your UV map around your track. So all you got to do is make sure this, I'm gonna bring it back. This host object is as big as, or a little bit bigger, and so you can bring this in on the y-axis to be closer, and you can see in real time. I'll move this up just so you can see it. But as I move it, it will follow. And you see if it goes too far in, it's now going to stretch it. So yeah, so you just want to make sure it comes to the edge, and you could tweak it later and do whatever, but that's just a simple way to rough it in. And this data transfer is not just for roads; it can work for Armco barriers, walls, whatever. And I'll show you some of that process a little bit later on. Particularly like concrete walls, you may want the texture to not repeat the same texture a million times. You may want different blocks to be different shades of color in random, and I can show you a little bit of that. But for now, we're not going to worry about it. It's a little more advanced finalization work. But it's say this data transfer modifier that we have here is very powerful and very handy to get you some rough UV maps without having to worry about having everything in quads. Because I say even though this isn't in perfect quads down here, it will follow for the most part. It's not always perfect, and may have to play with it and play with different settings depending on what you're doing, but it does a pretty good job of matching the host to this to the main the host UV to whatever you want to go to. So that was UV mapping the track surface. So now I just want to go over the basics of UV mapping, say this wall. It's very basic. It's just this is one of my wall sections. I have it into 4 sections. Um, and basically I'm going to start off with the pit wall wherever it is. There it is, pit wall. This is the same texture from Watkins Glen. You can see how I laid out the texture. Let me make this a little bigger for you. So with Watkins Glen on the main pit wall, you see all the advertisements going down the pit wall. So it's basically just a change in UV map. So I made one tall map and duplicated the wall, and then I did put the signs over top of the wall. Um, so that's just one way of doing it. I don't necessarily like to do, you'll see some tracks or some people do where they'll decal out the wall. So the wall will have a base color and then they will um, have a floating object in front of it that is your sign. But that sometimes can cause Z fighting over long distance shots and replay shots and flickering and weird things. So if I can, I like the signs to be part of the wall. So that requires the UV map to the texture atlas map to have all these particular sections. So you got to kind of plan out when you're building this how many sections you're going to have, so how big your texture is going to be. It's a little bit of pre-planning required, but anyway, this is a already made texture that I did. So we're just going to sign it uh, and line this up with this top section here. So all the U similar to before, all these pieces are this entire face, and we don't want that. So we want to pick one. Cursor selected. Select all. We're going to scale this down. And we want to scale this down to this section. And it don't have to be perfect right now, but so initially what we're going to do is select all and then again do the follow active quads. And that should give me, oh, I was in the wrong direction. Yeah, see, it's key to find it, make sure you're going in the right direction. It just needs to be rotated. So we're going to rotate 90. Actually, it needs to be mirrored on the y-axis, and then mirrored on the x-axis. That should make it so yes, and now it reads continental properly. Cursor selected, select all. Over here. All right, so now it looks right. follow active quads. Now it'll lay out like I want. So we can also do is copy faces. So we know that for this base wall, we want this face to be the same as this face over here. But you can see it kind of sprawls out. And then what you're seeing here is for the corner museum of glass here is all the way down at the bottom because the textures repeat themselves. So you got to think of it this way. We'll put it, show you as repeat. So this is what the game sees. It repeats on, up and down. So as you go off the texture, you're going to start showing at the bottom. We'll turn that off for now because we don't need that. So in a lot of ways, a lot of times what you can do is copy this. I have hotkeys set up for this, but you can just, although this might be actually be an add-on now that I think about it. I'll have to look, and if it is, I'll throw it in the description. But I think it's Control Shift C is my thing, and that as you say, it copied 4 faces. I think it's under here, copy paste UV. It is an add-on. So when I find it, I'll paste it in there. It may even be built in. Something like this could be built into 2.8. I don't know. But I copied that UV, and so I'm gonna come over here, and I'm gonna copy and paste it. So now both sides are identical without having to do too much work. I mean, you can come in here and select all of this and move this down, but that's gonna be, and then it'll have to be mirrored on the y-axis. And actually you can snap the closest. So select everything that's linked, snap the closest, so then that'll be the same too. But I usually copy paste usually works fairly well. It's not perfect, but again, it works fairly well. And depending on how detailed you care to have your top part of the wall, it's not super critical, but usually you can either have, in this particular case, I didn't have another top UV mask specific for the wall, so I just brought this down here, and that's pretty much it. And there's a little bit of a white line there from the top, which we want to get rid of. So just move that down slightly. And that gives you your basic wall. And then once you put the ray modifier and the curve modifier back, and there it is. It's laid out, and they say that. So then, if you wanted to do individual wall sections to have different banners with this texture is laid out, you would first have to apply this. Make sure, I always like to make sure merge is selected. You apply the array modifier. Oh, I'm in multi-user mode, so we want to get out of multi-user mode. Then we can do apply. So now we can come in here and say select 4 faces, since we know that's how wide the sections are, and we can come down here to Continental. So then that section is Continental Wall. And then we go to the next section of 4 faces, and we'll go down to, we'll put a set of course sign on there. So that's the basics of how you put, how I in any, put the banners on the walls. I just would go down the line, pick sections, and put them in. And it's, say even if it's more than four sections, um, if your wall ends up going the whole length, um, if you do follow up the quads like we did the road, and it keeps going off into the distance, it will still obviously keep repeating because as I showed before, the repeat will keep going. But with this particular case, just keep it in 4s. It'll always be like that. And again, we can just kind of scroll down to whatever you want it to be. That one didn't line up right actually because that's between 2 sections. So what we could do here is, you see this zone, this piece here. So we want to follow this active quad, move this on over, and that'll give us it to read properly. So that's just another way to use active quads, and to say that's why it's important to model in quads, or if you're converting something, to try to get it into quad mode by using the Alt-J command, because UV mapping and changing UV stuff like that is going to be a lot easier with using in quads. So the last thing here that I'll show, I think, in this video is basic material assignments. Where we assign this texture, at least in 2.79, does not pertain to anything as far as the export to the FBX file and putting it into the KS editor for Assetto Corsa. It does if you use the older FBX format, which would be 6.1, but we don't really use that anymore. We always pretty much use the FBX 7.4 binary. And when you do that, it does not care about this texture that is assigned that you see in this viewport. What it cares about is the material name. So I'm going to select the roads here, the main road here. So I just made a basic material called road, and that's really all you need for AC and the editor to work. That's all you need. You do not, doesn't matter if this is red, yellow, green, whatever. None of these values really matter. Some of them can come over into the editor, but really it's not a big deal. You go in there when I show the process of the editor, we'll show some of what goes on and how you set the materials up within the editor, but all we care about is the material name out here, and make sure you don't really change it, because if you say change this material name and you have your persistence set in the KS editor, it's next time you load it, it's going to be different and you're going to have to redo your settings. So you kind of want to set it and forget it as far as your material name. Now, a material can have more than one, an object can have more than one material assigned to it. Like you can see here, my pit lane, it's kind of been messed up since, we redid the UV maps, but the materials still remain. And you can see here, I have the concrete assigned, similar to the vertex groups. It's pretty much how that works. Select. So you can see my concrete is assigned to where the concrete areas are. So then if I come down here and assign, oh, sorry, uh, let's see, why is that not applied? Oh, sorry, my mistake. I didn't apply I want these modifiers to be applied, this data transfer. So I'm just going to convert to mesh and that'll apply the data transfer. So that's why I'm not seeing it. Anyway, um, so it has, so I want to select concrete, and I want to select my concrete box, which is my texture for the concrete box. And the UV map's not quite how we want it because that texture is laid out a little differently than the road. But anyway, it shows you the general idea that say the road is these faces, and that gets this texture. Again, this doesn't matter. It's just mainly for seeing it within Blender itself, not for the editor. And then we come in here to concrete and we select, and it'll show you what is assigned concrete. And the same thing for this section here. Turn 3 and 4 is concrete. We select it. We're going to come here and change our concrete box so we can visualize it. But that really, I was saying all that matters is these are assigned properly. And what's going to happen here is when we export this into the editor, it's actually going to make sort of a second object. So yes, an object can have multiple materials, but once you get out to the editor, it will break it into what we call a sub-object. So it basically makes it into two objects. It's not a big deal, just something to be aware of that, this is basically going to be two objects, and this is going to be two objects, where this will be one because it only has one material assigned. So again, that's just the basics. Going forward, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about in the next episode the basics of setting up your spawn points, and then we're actually going to bring this track into the editor and get it into the game and do some test driving on it. Again, we're not done yet, obviously. We still got a long way to go, but we want to get it in game so we can test drive it, see how the mesh feels after what we did. And again, you could have done this long before this point, but it's nice to have some detail on track instead of just a floating road. Again, you can do that, but it's nice to have a little bit of detail to know where you are and see what's going on. Even to say it just makes sometimes it can be confusing to even know what the track is and how it could be without having some kind of visualization around you. So yeah, so that's what we'll go over in what is this 3? So we'll go over that in episode 4. We'll get it in game, and we'll go from there.